Steven Pinker is a well-renowned professor at Harvard University and the author of several beautifully written books like Enlightenment Now and The Blank Slate. He was named one of Time's 100 most influential people in 2004, and he's been the winner of several distinguished awards, none of which you've ever heard of. No stranger to controversy, he's been challenged by other scholars both in writing and in debate on several of his more controversial positions, such as that there is some essentialism in human nature as a result of evolution, his assertion that, alongside socialization and bias, the role of women in society may partially be determined by evolutionary influences, and his determined claim that post-Enlightenment reason has been part of the ongoing betterment of the world. Today I want to take up a facet of Pinker's work that's equally as controversial but not quite so often covered, his views on religion. Pinker claims to have become an atheist at the age of 13 and never looked back, so it shouldn't surprise us when some of his viewpoints come off as a little bit childish. In this video, I'll describe exactly what he says faith is, and then offer two responses, one concerning his very adamant but equally ungrounded ethical views, and one concerning his willfully naive beliefs about what reason, unaccompanied by the ethical necessary moorings, is capable of. Beyond holding a merely atheistic position taken on intellectual grounds, Pinker is a bit more of an ardent advocate against religion. He works with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, an organization that helps to forward lawsuits aimed at removing religious voices from the public sphere under the auspices of maintaining the separation of church and state. They are essentially the political wing of atheism. When Pinker talks about faith, his commentary is remarkably vacuous. For a Harvard professor, he seems to have no intention of presenting anything but a straw man, a flimsy misrepresentation of the faith community, which he does with a snide condescension. From his assorted side commentary, we can basically discern two arguments. One, faith is opposed to reason, and reason is right, so faith is wrong. He says, quote, "Faith means believing something with no good reason to do it." What a deception! He never addresses or responds to the centuries of rational arguments for the existence of God. This ranges from the well-known and widely recognized contemporary academic apologists like William Lane Craig, to the now famous Cambridge scholar of the last century C.S. Lewis, all the way back to the monolithic works of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, in which Aquinas argues for a rational basis for theism without appeal to Scripture. We could look even to the reasoned attempts of the first century Christian apostles to prove the grounds of their faith by referencing living eyewitness accounts. For literally hundreds of years, the greatest minds in Western thought have been arguing that there is reason undergirding faith, and that doctrine without reason should be abandoned. Pinker seems to have missed all this. Now, when a Harvard professor simply turns a blind eye on centuries of history, we should call this what it is. This isn't intellectual clarity. This is prejudice. This is willful ignorance that springs from arrogance. Pinker means to say that he need not consider the possibility that Aquinas or Lewis or Craig are his intellectual equals. Elsewhere he says, quote, "Logically, there are not compelling reasons to believe in God." And then he never addresses the centuries of arguments which philosophers felt compelled them to believe in God. His second argument is that religious people do bad things, so religion is bad. I kid you not, this is the extent of the sophistication of his argument. Quote, "Religions have given us stonings, witch burnings, crusades, inquisitions, jihads, fatwas, suicide bombers, gay bashers, abortion clinic gunmen, and mothers who drown their sons so they can happily be united in heaven," he says. Elsewhere, he describes religious leaders as manipulating a function of psychology by pretending to abase themselves to a hypothetical higher power and then expecting congregants to abase themselves to the leader. He then compares the clergy to a car salesman who deceptively appeals to a boss in the back room who won't let him lower the price of a car. There are two obvious fallacies he's committing here. First, there's a fallacy of composition. A religious terrorist doesn't make religion terrible. Secondly, he commits the fallacy of what's called an insufficient sample or hasty generalization. Religious influences have been responsible for the development of medicine and hospitals, schools, and even science itself. In Enlightenment Now, Pinker claims to give a detailed history of how reason has made everything better, but he offers no well thought out account of how religious people have contributed to the betterment of society, which is plainly the case. Again, this isn't circumspection, this is prejudice. He once told Bill Maher of religion, "We know it isn't true." Who's we? Is it most people living in the world now or throughout history? No, because most people in every era, in every culture, have been religious in one way or another. Does he mean we Americans? Well, no, again, because most Americans are religious. Religion comes about naturally, and atheism must be taught and reinforced. What he means by we are academic elites with specific biases, political leanings, and entitlements. They know it isn't true because the modern university systematically excludes views which diverge from its atheistic orthodoxy. Not only is this prejudiced, it's pejorative, and I'm not sure why it wouldn't be considered hate speech. And I can't imagine being a freshman at Harvard and listening to your professor ridicule your beliefs. Certainly somebody who's studied psychology should understand the impact of intimidation in a power relation that isn't balanced. So here are my two responses. One, Pinker is adamantly moralistic, but his ethics are completely ungrounded for three reasons. Reason number one, he says that reason dictates that I must have a kind of sympathy that does not prioritize my own desires over someone else's. But this runs contrary to what evolutionary psychologists say we're wired for. They commonly claim that the source of ethical thought is protection of kin, self, and tribe. Evolution has predisposed me to survive, and sympathy is only binding so long as it is functional to this end. His would-be metropolitanism runs counter to what most of the world actually does. We prioritize our own families, and we are largely nationalistic. We protect our own tribe and presume that other tribes are competition and threat. Insisting that his ethical norm is better than what most of the world actually does is itself a form of egoism and tribalism. He thinks that people who see things his way are better than those who don't, and those who see it otherwise, particularly religious people, are a threat to his tribe. He thinks enlightenment and democracy should triumph over other forms of government or religious doctrine, so he is in fact tribal. He is still a white Westerner waiting for the day when the backward countries in Asia and the Middle East finally come around to seeing things his way. Second, Pinker appeals to moral facts that he believes are universal. But evolution undermines moral realism. Watch my video on evolutionary debunking arguments to understand why. Third, his own ethic obviously excuses his arrogant condescension towards most of humanity, which is religious. So his ethic doesn't require of him traditional intellectual virtues such as humility, the willingness to present an opponent's argument in the best possible light in order to address it truthfully, and graciousness. In the end, his angry insistence on his own ethical superiority is hypocritical, and his ethics are completely ungrounded. My second response is this. Pinker is overconfident that reason is doing salvific work for humanity. In Enlightenment Now, he ventures out of psychology and into philosophy, and he goes woefully unprepared for the trip. The fruit of religion is all bad, says Pinker, but he seems not to have studied the history of philosophy and particularly religious influence on philosophers for whom religion is a motivator. For instance, Pinker defends life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, captured by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, borrowed from John Locke. But Pinker doesn't seem to have read Locke. Locke defends his moral virtues from a specifically Christian worldview. He quotes abundantly from the Bible as he defends tolerance and liberty. Pinker simply comes off as poorly read here. A Harvard professor. Jefferson explicitly says that these natural rights are given to humanity by their creator. It was actually an atheist that opposed the Declaration of Independence and its claim to natural rights. Jeremy Bentham was an atheist philosopher and the foundational writer about an ethical system called utilitarianism, which is the ethical system of Steven Pinker. And Bentham wrote against the Declaration of Independence, saying that natural rights were, quote, nonsense on stilts. The stilts were theology, which Bentham had no room for, and the nonsense came from his belief that human beings do not individually have rights. A human being can't be afforded specific dignity. It's actually the benefit of all humanity that counts the most, and if some people get squashed in that process, then so be it. That's at the heart of utilitarianism. That's the most favored ethical system for those who want to reject religion. That's Pinker's ethical system. Pinker wants to defend life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as an organic development out of the natural state of humanity. But why is it that Muslim governments have never landed there, and the Chinese and Indian governments have never landed there? The Muslim governments are not committed to the teachings of Jesus, and the Chinese and Indian governments are committed to a form of nationalistic utilitarianism. It's actually Judeo-Christian morality that produced the civil society, the liberal democracy that Pinker holds so dear. Enlightenment reason, on the other hand, is a tree that's produced quite a few fruit that Pinker is at pains to minimize. It was the ruthless pursuit of industrialization through the birth of technology that produced Enlightenment science and that created the climate crisis we're facing today. Science, via technology and social Darwinism, fueled the slave trade. It was Enlightenment confidence that wrote the check for colonialism, and untempered atheistic scientific pursuits that have created sufficient nuclear power to blow the world up several times over. Deny it as much as you can. Explicitly atheistic regimes of Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and Ceausescu wreaked havoc in the 20th century and led to the deaths of over 100 million people. Enlightenment reason has produced technology capable of doing the most destruction humanity has ever seen because there is no ethics undergirding it. There is no case to be made for atheism and reason producing better ethical results than simply following Jesus. So in the end, not only does Pinker fail as a credible scholar on the subject of religion, he proves to be an especially deceptive, hypocritical, and prejudiced voice in the public sphere. Voices like his are not harmless because they come from exactly the same intellectual posture as those whose tyrannies have persecuted religious minorities. And in a day where, worldwide, followers of Jesus are still the most persecuted ideological group in the world, one wonders at the callousness of a so-called voice of reason. That's a brief introduction to the religion of Steven Pinker. Hope that's helpful. Blessings on your studies.